Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. I am tremendously honored and just delighted to have John Beebe back. And I'm talking today to him about one of my favorite topics in Jung, and I think one of his key contributions as far as I can understand his work. So we're going to be talking about archetypes. So John, welcome.
Hello. Hello.
So John, when did you come across the idea of archetypes first?
I didn't come across the idea first. I came across the experience first. And so that makes me want to go back to my childhood. Edward Edinger, who is a very famous Jungian analyst who wrote a book called Ego and Archetype that later became probably the book that more than any other created a kind of national interest in Jungian psychology because it was so clearly written and it was published by Penguin Books. And there's some of you may have been or know of the famous center point groups that were all over America in the 1970s. I mean, somewhere between 1970 and 1980, there were 50 different center point groups that came and went in just Portland, Oregon alone. And suddenly all kinds of people were studying Jungian psychology that no one would have ever imagined would be doing it. Retired military officers, groups of people that were not psychotherapists or hadn't devoted their lives as I came to do to this practice of Jungian analysis as a psychiatrist and psychotherapist, very much in the footsteps of Jung. Many people were finding Jung to be speaking to their own middle lives and later life development. And of course, Edinger had written an outline of Jungian psychology, which was sent to everyone in the Centerpoint movement. And the Centerpoint came out of the Episcopal Church in, now I can't remember whether it was Kansas City or St. Louis at this moment, but you would know. And for a long time, it became almost so interesting that finally the bishop had to say, you know, we're not having the Episcopal Church only to teach Jungian psychology, and so Centerpoint developed a life of its own, and really brought a lot of people in, as many other people had found Jung's work not because they were therapists or even in therapy, but because it was speaking to something important that happens. But it was Edward Edinger who said that people who seem to go the farthest with the idea of a collective unconscious are people who had some experience of it already in childhood. So you need to know that my mother was born in Atlanta, Georgia, and my father was born in Wichita, Kansas. And they met, and because they were both living in the same essentially boarding house that doubled as a law students fraternity, and also had some rooms for women. And my mother was one of those people, and she was. They married on her 20th birthday after a 1-month courtship, and so. She loved movies. And so I grew up with, of course, Gone with the Wind, because at that time people weren't questioning its rather obvious political incorrectness. It was sort of a mythic movie that came out of the place where she had been born by a woman writer who had never published before, Margaret Mitchell, and became a movie with Vivian Leigh, and my mother had many of those characteristics. My father had Clark Gable's mustache, and they had this almost as difficult a marriage, maybe more difficult a marriage than Red and Scarlet, and they were florid and dramatic in every possible way. But my mother also was a sort of had a brief period in a little town in Pennsylvania where she was temporarily a newspaper movie critic until they banned her from free passes to the movies because she criticized one of the films. And so that was such a disconcerting experience for her that it upset her so much that she came down with pneumonia and almost died, because this was the pre-penicillin era, and finally some sulfa drugs saved her life. But that's how much both being reviewing movies and taking the blowback from me for not saying the right thing about a movie hit her. So for some reason, the movies were also quite a part of my earliest upbringing. So when I was 18 months old, she held me up to see The Wizard of Oz. I was born in 1939. And of course, the interesting thing about The Wizard of Oz is it's about a little girl from Kansas, and my father was from Kansas. So this made a certain link between the world of my mother and the feminine and the world of my father and the masculine, because really my father, who eventually became, after 1941, a military officer because he'd taken ROTC in college at Wichita Municipal University, where his mother had been a teacher of Greek and Latin. So he got free college tuition, and he was the president of the Young Democrats, and went into ROTC, and on their first date told my mother that he was going to be president of the United States someday. He was 23 and she was 20 when they married in 1938. And so I was born a year later in 1939. And so the coming of the war gave him his opportunity to get a military record. But to his great disappointment, he wasn't sent into combat in World War II. He didn't go overseas until the war was over, but he did go to Japan and was part of the team that interrogated Tojo, the prime minister of the war party in Japan. And then he went on to China. And so my mother and I, who had been living in Baltimore, Maryland while he was overseas, traveled by ship to Shanghai, China in November of 1946. And there, between November of 1946 and November of 1948, when we were, as the Army said, evacuated, because quite soon Mao's forces, which were then north in Mukden near Manchuria, were going to come down and invade. And indeed, they did invade in April of 1949, but we were by then in the United States, and my mother had gotten a divorce from my father. So I was living in China, in a country that was coming apart because of a civil war that was about to become a reality, and a very difficult marriage between a mother who was truly beautiful, looked like, was said to be more beautiful than Rita Hayworth in the 40s, taken for Grace Kelly in the 50s. Wow. When she was even a child, was called Baby Garbo. So she was a gorgeous woman, and in her youth. And so she was definitely from Venus. She even had a certain ring she bought in China that had a star sapphire, and you might as well, Ishtar herself could have worn that ring. You look into it as sort of a milkstone that had a star. It wasn't really a sapphire at all. It was a milkstone that had a star, and it was a very uncanny Near Eastern goddess sort of thing. So surely my mother was one of my first archetypes. And my father was from Mars. He was absolutely the military man. He later did become a battalion commander in Korea and later trained Green Berets and so forth. So they had the classic marriage of the woman from Venus and the man from Mars. And there I was. And I guess not surprisingly, when I was 7 years old, I told everybody that what I wanted to be when I grew up was an astronomer.
Hmm.
And I was saying that to people that we met in China. And these were, my mother and father were a popular young couple. They were a little bit like Scott Fitzgerald and Zelda Fitzgerald. They were extremely popular young people who were attractive. And so they would be invited over protocol to parties given by various countries, ambassadors and so forth, that were all in China in the waning days of any chance of the West having anything to say about China. China was going to become for the Chinese. And so it was really kind of a strange waiting operation. And it was, in a way, it was like, in a way, being in a novel that could have been written in the 1930s, being in China in the period from 46 to 48. So I was an only child. My parents were out 200 nights of the week, and I would sit alone and have dinner. And we had a staff of 7 servants. We lived in we lived in a merchant's house in Nanking, and there was a quote unquote number 1 boy, as it was said. He was actually a middle-aged man named, of all things, Yang, and his wife was named Ying. So Yang and Ying, she was my ama, and then we had a driver, a chauffeur, and this and that, and cook. So I would sit alone in this big room and have dinner alone with these servants. So I was also isolated from the other army children because my father was attached to the embassy. So he wasn't part of the 300 military advisors exactly. We were closer to embassy people. So there was one little girl whose name was Alice Turner, who would come over to my house, and we would have play dates together. And the play date would be to go down into the literally the basement of this big house we lived in, and I lived in China. And she would come, and we would sit together. And an older woman friend of my mother's, when we'd still been in the United States, named Mrs. Egan, Bertine Egan, had given my mother a set of something like 20 Oz books that had belonged to her children, and that she'd given them one a year as they came out, when they actually first came out. And so Alice Turner and I, when we were both 7 years old, sat together and read the Oz books over and over and over. And when we finished them, we went back and read them again. And the Oz stories, as written by L. Frank Baum and continued by, after his death in 1919, by Ruth Plumley Thompson, whom I later had the opportunity to actually meet in the 1950s, were an absolutely delightful set of stories with all kinds of wonderful archetypal characters. One of my favorite was the Patchwork Girl of Oz, who was a female trickster. And so she, and the whimsy and the fun of these various characters, well beyond whatever I'd gotten at that point from the movie, which was not yet available on television every year as it became in my later childhood, and really spoke to me. And especially what spoke to me was the map of the land of Oz, which was it was rectangular. It was surrounded by a deadly desert. And in the very center was the Emerald City. But each of the 4 countries of Oz, the northern Gillikin country, was purple. It was sort of more or less triangular in this rectangle. And the point that it came to would be the edge of the Emerald City. The southern country was where Glinda the Good reigned, was the Quadling country, and it was red. And then because Baum, L. Frank sensation function was so bad, between different books, you would find the Winky country in the West and the Munchkin country in the East. And then later he would flip them because he couldn't keep track of it and his illustrator couldn't keep track of it. So I also experienced what it was like to receive an archetype through the limitations of personal psychology. So I would obsessively draw this map of the land of Oz over and over again. I'm 7 and 8 years old.
Mhm.
And I think that was my first mandala, you see. And a mandala is a protected space, a temenos, a sacred space where there's a certain protection. One interpretation of the mandala images that we see from Tibet is that in a sense they're a cross section of an architectural diagram of a stupa, S-T-U-P-A, a Buddhist sacred enclosure, and they represent a place of safety. So schizophrenic people who become disoriented often will draw mandalas. Much later, when I was at a VA hospital getting my psychiatric residency training, I met a man who, after his psychotic breakdown, had obsessively kept drawing this circle with 4 quadrants over and over again. And I asked him, what is that? And he said, it's a gear shift. I was trying to learn to drive a car and shift the gears just before I had my breakdown. And I keep thinking that if I could only learn how to get the gears right, I might be able to get out of this hospital. So that amazing thing that Jung talks about was really it's very obvious that it's sort of a natural, spontaneous thing when there's so much disorientation. Here we have parents who are arguing the loudest possible way and drinking a bit and then going out and being dazzling socially. But I'd see their arguments before they went out because my mother was always late getting dressed and my father felt that she was violating protocol and it was hurting his career and his political future if he didn't arrive on time. And they would just get, I got to feeling, I was afraid they would kill each other. My mother once threw a very heavy metal pot at him, and if it hit him, she probably would have killed him. So it was really quite a dreadful scene. But down in the basement with Alice Turner, who I was happy to learn many, many years later became the executive director of Merce Cunningham's dance group. And so she was also to have that archetypal experience must have opened up something for her too. We didn't, unfortunately, I didn't realize that till after she was gone, that had happened. I would have definitely, I always wondered what happened to her, but actually that was not Alice, but a dear friend of ours named Jean. Because I got a little mixed up there. So as usual, when you do memory, things transpose. It was our third friend that we went exploring together all over Nanking. Mm-hmm. The 3 of us, Alice and Jean became, so I don't know what became of Alice. I do know what became of Jean, and I never got in touch with her, but Jean was like a third thing for us, perhaps in a certain sense, an anima figure for both of us. Jean was very beautiful. And so all of that childhood world of centering myself and feeling safe through the feminine, through Dorothy, who went to Oz, through Baum's anima, Ozma was the ruler, through something feminine that was not my mother, with her oppositional stance toward my father, but something more integrated, Glinda the Good with her book of records. It's very much the magic book, like the I Ching, that I later got fond of when I learned about it many years after leaving China. The magic picture that's like this was happening right now, that it's possible for me to sit in San Francisco and talk to you, have actually all been realized, not least that in 50 years later, I went back to China and was the keynote speaker at the first, and on, like my father, a diplomatic mission sent by the International Association of Analytical Psychology to China to open up China as a place for training in analytical psychology. And these days, here I am. That was 1998. I went back to Nanking, walked on the same street with that same street sign with Tien Shan Lu, where we had lived, 132 Heavenly Mountain Road, and with the name of it in both Chinese and English. And I was at the location of the house, now torn down and ugly 50s Chinese communist high-rise apartment, but the International Club where my parents had entertained and given parties or been to parties, and all the rest of the places I saw again, stayed in. And now, this is now 23 years later, thanks to me and other Jungian analysts who've gone to China. There's a C.G. Jung Institute in China.
Wow.
And they have 10 analysts, and they're about to be qualifying in our next chance to do their own training. Psychology is now the most popular major in Chinese universities, and Jungian psychology, though not the most popular as it is definitely on the map. And so that magical world that I found as a child, where you could integrate something and contain something and transform something, rather than it simply being splitting and quarreling and divisiveness, as I'd seen both in the dangerous situation in the Chinese Civil War and in my parents' marriage, that it could be that integrative, I think gave me a confidence that whatever my immediate unfortunate experience was, imagination and vision and basically archetype could move me along. So that sense never left me. And there were 3 places where it showed up in my childhood and young and adolescence that are worthy of note, because they were definitely moments when I either reached for or spontaneously created or perceived in an embodied way something that made me understand what an archetype is beyond just participating as a viewer of a wonderful movie or 2 wonderful movies, The Wizard of Oz and Gone with the Wind from 1939. The one that has stayed important to me is the movie Wizard of Oz. That's one thing, to participate vicariously through the vision of an artist. And the other is to do something that may not be unrelated to art, but is somehow more either initiated or appropriated by me in a much more original way. So these are the things I'll talk about. My mother divorced my father to marry a French diplomat from a very good family, who promised her the moon and turned out to be kind of an eternal boy, because no sooner had the divorce come than on her next birthday, a letter came from my father saying that he had decided not to marry my mother. They were both under house arrest in Nanking, and they'd had a chance to meet, and my father had told him some things about my mother, including some psychiatric history she had. He had a mother that had political ambitions in France. She later became a mayor of Paris and a member of the French Assembly. She was running for Senate. She was in the de Gaulle party. She did not want her son, who was a from a famous family. His father had been tortured by the Nazis, and he had been a leader of the Free French under de Gaulle. And she did not want her political ambitions ruined in Catholic France by him marrying an American divorcee. And then when he learned about from my father about my mother's psychiatric history, because she'd had a year in a military hospital for depression after that episode of being refused at the movie theater, that probably today would have been a 2-week hospitalization, if any hospitalization at all, but then became a stain. And my father, so that sunk her chances. And so suddenly I was the only thing left in my mother's life, and I became absolutely everything to her. And she moved us to Princeton, New Jersey, because she'd been reading F. Scott Fitzgerald, and she thought he was had been at Princeton. She wanted me to go to Princeton. She just began to live for me and for she had dropped out of school at the age of 15. She wanted me to get the best education possible. So she started sending out applications. There was a public competition for a free scholarship to a preparatory school called the Hun School in Princeton. I won the scholarship. I became the #1 student in the school. From that, I got another scholarship to the Lawrenceville School, an extremely famous school that was the prep school for Princeton, and I got the highest average in that school. Mm-hmm. My grades didn't start to drop or my rebellion there didn't start to happen until I had been accepted to Harvard and went there, and she was furious that I went to Harvard and not to Princeton, because she lived in New Jersey and she didn't want me to be that far away. And but I wanted to be my own person, and so that became an estrangement that we had, and to some degree. And so you can only imagine some of the energies from this extroverted, intuitive young man that had an introverted, intuitive mother that maybe we could have been when I was younger, the two intuitives against my thinking sensation father, but they were the irrationals against the rational. But later in adolescence, the extroversion, introversion really began to divide us. But even before then, and this is where I want to bring in the archetype, mm-hmm. My mother's over-attachment to me, her over-seriousness about what I was going to be, and her basically turning me into a kind of child husband, was really something in me was already reacting to it. The first dream that I could remember when I was about 4 years old came on an army base in 1943, when the army had POWs, prisoners of war, who were from Germany. And so there was a German young man of about 23 years old just mowing the lawns. I mean, that's how it was in America then. What they deny it, punitive. And so he was very nice to me and liked me, and it was friendly. And then that night I had a dream that brought in the other side, that there was some green man that was swimming toward me from across the ocean. And I woke up in incredible terror, just terror at this. A Freudian would have called that homophobia, because I'm sure there was an attraction on both sides, and I think that was probably one way to look at it. But from a Jungian point of view, that green man had frightened me so much, stayed in my memory, so that after my mother and I were back from China, and she was now not going to get married, and she had to work to support herself, and she got a job basically as a typist, and was aiming to be a secretary. It was pretty hard, no matter how nice you looked, and without much education to do very much. But she did the best she possibly could, and in the 50s. And so something about her insistent seriousness about me required a compensatory response from me. So we would go to the seashore, and you could buy shells or even pick them up at the sea or buy them in the shop. Atlantic coast has a lot of places. If you've ever been on the Atlantic coast, you know the Atlantic City's the most famous, but there's Point Pleasant and Asbury Park, and we would go to these places on the weekends, drive there. I had a shell that I painted, and inside the shell, I pictured this image of this green man, except that he had a very wicked grin on his face. And I would place this shell so that my mother would look at it so that she could see this grinning trickster looking back at her. So I transformed this image that had terrified me, whatever it was, into this kind of trickster. And it was a certain kind of payback. Now, I'm not entirely proud of this from a moral point of view, but it was an archetype of autonomy in a home. You know, when I went to Harvard and my grades dropped, I sort of left you up in the air with that. My mother said to me, when I had control, you had straight A's. My mother was a very direct woman. So there was reason why I needed that grinning. So that was my first archetype, even more than drawing the map of the Land of Oz, which was taking a cultural image that I could appropriate to secure myself, and very successfully, I think. But this was my archetype. It was my dream, and I also played with the archetype. So I didn't just take it as a terror, but I was in my own way integrating it.
Go ahead.
So
You're saying that you played with the
archetype
archetypes.
of the trickster was absolutely critical to me. I didn't know what it meant, except that it was a way to tease my mother. Actually, what it really was, and it was my wicked side, no question. And I'm sure there was all kinds of stuff in it. But it somehow must have represented my own masculine position vis-a-vis her animus. You could say it that way. And of course, I now know that trickster archetype is the archetype of separation and individuation in childhood, particularly during the famous period of the terrible twos, when you get a chance to say mother, to test mother's authority. And this became rather important to me. It also became important to me to realize my need for autonomy in a less archetypal way. But that was the archetype, and I think it's pretty interesting that I put it against a shell. I think that's very interesting. But I just leave it there because I think the archetypes are shells, and in my theory of psychological types, I sort of see our consciousness as coming to us, given to us in archetypal shells. Now, since my mother was such a Venus, Aphrodite, as you know, was sort of born on the half shell out of foam in the ocean. And so in a certain sense, this was my archetype against her archetype. And so it became the basis of a lifetime of enjoying and deploying a wicked sense of humor, I'm afraid, and that can sometimes have a life of its own. But it also it was an expression of autonomy.
You said that there were three things. This was the first.
And these are the first of three. Now remember, I'm now at Harvard and I'm in a bunch of sophisticates, and we used to make fun of Jungian criticism when I was at Harvard in the 1950s, you know, myth themes and archetypes. It all sounded, it seemed too easy or too glib, and we were, because the attitude, it was so anti-imaginal. I mean, you know, I can't even tell you how people thought that the unconscious had already been deciphered by Freud, and there was nothing more to say. Some upperclassman at Harvard once asked me, but after I made the decision I wanted to go to medical school and be a psychiatrist, whether I was going to be a follower of Freud or Jung. And I said, well, there's a little bit of Jung that interests me because of his interest in dreams, because I'd always been interested in dreams. He said, oh, well, tell me one of your dreams. So I mentioned a repetitive dream and to him that I'd had of encountering women celebrities in public situations. I think those dreams had a lot to do with my mother, but I just told him the dream, and then he said, oh, I see. So you have stereotyped dreams as well as conversation. You know, the depreciative attitude toward dreams. Everybody thought they knew what a dream meant. And it had to have a sexual meaning, and it also, there was a sense that we're bored with all that. So any mention of Jung was not something that made it major popular back then. I happened to meet people who knew about Jung, but so far, I'd even had a course, and very unusual, that had a great psychologist named Henry Murray, who had actually been in analysis with Jung, and they assigned Modern Man in Search of a Soul. So I read that, but I wasn't sure. I didn't take to the notion of archetype or anything until I was about 21 years old or so, 22, and already in medical school, and went back to Cambridge, Massachusetts, spent the summer with friends that I had known when I was in college. I was at the University of Chicago now, and as always, I needed money, and there was a what's the word you'd use? A research project being taken at Massachusetts General Hospital that wanted volunteers who were willing to stay in the hospital for a week, be fed a low-fat diet, and then tested to see what the effect on their cardiac health was. And so they wanted young, healthy volunteers. So I had to go, and it was well paid for several $100s to do this, and all your meals taken care of because you'd be in the hospital, even though it would be low-fat food and or non-fat food. Anyway, I went into the hospital, and so I had to have something to do all day. So when you're in a college like Harvard, there's about 1,000 books you should have read and you haven't read. And so I took a copy of the Brothers Karamazov with me because I thought at last I'll have time to read this, and I'll read it. So I read it. And when I read the Brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky is like reading Dostoevsky. It's impossible to read Dostoevsky without your mind going on fire if you don't surrender to it. It's an amazing experience, and there's no writer like him. And the truth is, I would read everything he had to say, but I'm not sure I could set myself on fire that often. So even I have only read a few of his great novels, but they all have the same effect. And the Brothers K was really something for me to read. And it's a story about a father and 3 sons, and then one of the sons becomes interested in Father Zosimos, and who is sort of makes up for what the old man Karamazov wasn't as a father, much better, much more spiritual father. So, but what I saw about the book, which is so large, and the people I was reading, like Henry James, had complained of the size of the great Russian novels. He called them loose and baggy monsters. He was interested in a more tight modern novel form, and I was trying to think in those terms as an English major. That was gold standard for me. And when I read this book and I saw it, I realized, I see, yes, it's got so many different things, but I see the thing that the principle of organization is the idea of the Father. The idea of the Father is all over this book. And it unites this book so that every sentence, every character, it's not what Henry James said. It's not a loose and baggy monster because it's organized. And that was the moment consciously that I became aware of what an archetype was. And I was just in awe that it was possible to make a work of art that was organized by an archetype and sustain it in performance for something like whatever, 600 pages or something. And it was absolutely, I was just aglow, not just a fire, but a glow with the idea of what an archetype was. And so that, then I knew what Jung was talking about. Then I knew. That didn't make, I wasn't sure at that point I was going to be a Jungian analyst or anything like that. It was just a very private experience of what an archetype is from a reading experience. A couple of years later, I had the third of the experiences that I want to tell you about with in relation to the archetype. And that was when, I guess we're talking about 1964, when there was an expo in New York. I don't know if you know that there was a time when the World's Fairs and expos were very popular. And one of them, if I recall correctly, took place in New York, and a kind of New York World's Fair kind of thing, but it was called Expo. And they brought over Michelangelo's Pieta.
Oh, really?
From the Vatican. And it was in its own tent. And it was placed on an extraordinary blue velvet. I now know, of course, the blue is the color of the Virgin Mary. I didn't know that then. It was just a very dramatic presentation. And of course, it's a young work that Michelangelo did when he was in his 20s, I think. And it shows an extremely young and beautiful Mary, just really almost a girl, with her son, Jesus, portrayed not as a child, as a young man, but not, he doesn't look as old as in his 30s as we believe he was when he was crucified, but actually he looks young too, perhaps in his 20s, but a more adolescent, and she's holding his dead body in her arms. It's a very famous image, and I'm probably not describing it properly visually, but I'm giving you the impact of memory. The minute my mother saw that, her eyes teared up in an absolute response. And I was horrified because I realized that this was the fate in store for me. I was supposed to die young, and she would be the beautiful widow of her beautiful son. And it was just as clear to me that what was going on in the background. Jung describes this perfectly in Ion. And so I'll read it to you.
Please.
If I can find it. I have it here somewhere. Leave that aside for the moment. Maybe I'll come back to that later. We can find that later. I've moved Ion because I must have looked at it for another reason. But it was that moment at which I realized that my mother and I were caught in an archetypal pattern, and the fact that I'd gone away to the school of my choice, that I was becoming a doctor, that by no means was I free of it. And I think more than anything else, that motivated me to get into psychotherapy as soon as I could afford it. And then so it was only a year later that I graduated from medical school, and that fall I had my first appointment with, it turned out to be a Jungian analyst. I didn't expect to go to a Jungian analyst. I'd been strongly interested in Carl Rogers. I wanted very much to, but I was doing my internship in San Francisco, and I wanted to get a Rogerian therapist because on the campus in Chicago in those days, Eugene Gendlin, who created a technique many of you know now as the focusing technique. My name is on the first paper about the focusing technique because I worked with him. I had an elective with him, and I liked that method. I liked Rogerian therapy. I wanted to do something like that. And I happened to ask someone who knew a lot about psychotherapy because he was at my hospital, and he was Thomas Kirsch, his parents were Jungian analysts. He was a Jungian, but he said he would try to find out. So he asked, and he said, don't seem to be any Rogerians, but there is a man who, when Carl Rogers comes to town, he stays at this man's house. Would that be okay? He's a Jungian analyst. And that's how I got into my first Jungian analysis with the man who is John Perry, who was the man that Carl Rogers stayed at the house of. And Perry had a very Rogerian technique. And so he didn't tell me a lot of things. He didn't make a lot of interpretations. He was very good with dreams, but he stayed very close to the surface. But he let me tell my story. And when I went to see him, I was suffering immediately from a reader's block. Everything that had gotten me through medical school had done its job, and I was accepted to a psychiatric residency. Thank heaven I was in effect drafted out of it by being told that if I left the public health service, which I was getting the internship in, I would immediately be my name would be given to the Secretary of the Army, and I would be drafted and go to Vietnam. So if I wanted to stay in the public health service, I could. So I stayed in the public health service and was able to keep on with my analysis at that time, 1966, 67. Didn't start my residency till 68. So during that time, I could work on my reader's block because I couldn't read anything. And I after 2 sentences, I could read nothing. And I was very depressed about that because I thought my future career as a psychiatrist, if I couldn't even read, I wouldn't be able to do the work. And I think what had happened is that I tried too hard to use extroverted thinking, but I was not an extroverted thinking type. So I really, my psyche was on a kind of sit down strike. But my analyst said to me, I kept talking about what I called my depression, and he said, "Do you ever dream when you're depressed?" And that just woke me up, and because I'd always dreamed, and as I told you at Harvard, nobody gave that any value. Mm-hmm. So that was the moment I realized in a flash that that's all I did was dream, that this rational education that I'd done to please my mother and my father in their different ways was not me at all. And the real me was the dreamer. And so what he meant by dreams and what I meant by dreams were two different things. But I did find one thing. As soon as he said that and was willing to say dream and accord it some value, I could tell him my dreams and I could read my dreams. And because I could read my dreams, I would want to know what they said. And I found that there was one person I could read, and that was C.G. Jung. So for the next several years, that's all I read was C.G. Jung. But I could read him, and it's quite a good enough education, I'm sure, as you all know. And so with that, a lot of things tumbled into place, including eventually the book by Morlius-Lanfrance, The Problem of the Puer Eternus, the Eternal Boy, in which he talks about the dread impersonal pattern of the death mother. And Jung talks about it in Ion, how the sacred marriage of mother and son by which they betray life. And she talks about the death aspect. She talks about Saint-Exupéry, who did die young. And then I could see that in that third iteration, I had of the archetype, from trickster to the archetype of the father to finally how deeply moved my mother was. Now, don't think that I don't try to verify these intuitions, because I do. And I wait until life tells me. Toward the end of her life, when my mother was getting to feel that she better make plans for time of her death, her family had bought plots for her mother and sister, her mother's sister, and her. She, like me, was an only child. Those two were dead. There was one plot left. My mother actually wrote to me. She said, I'm sorry we don't have a plot for you, but you could share mine when you die, and then we could be forever together forever.
Wow.
My mother was nothing if not blatant.
Mm-hmm.
But that was much later. And much later, I saw the Pietà again in middle life.
Mm-hmm.
And I saw it in a very different way, because this time, I didn't take it so personally. This time I saw the young Mary, and again, I thought of my mother as a young woman, but that young Jesus, that was her animus, which died when she was jilted by the man that she had loved and wanted to marry, that she thought would treat her better than my father had treated her.
Wow.
And so it was her tragedy, not mine.
Wow.
She and I could have acted it out, or I could have taken it for her and lived it with her, because I'm very good at living other people's archetypes. It's part of what an analyst is. But later I could be objective enough to see that that was her suffering. And that was her suffering. It was no longer mine. I had survived. My fears, though, as a young man, were not completely ill-founded. Of the people I knew who were my age, born in 1939, you wouldn't know how many died young. If they didn't die in Vietnam, or they didn't die of a mountain accident, or they didn't die of suicide with LSD, or they didn't die of AIDS,
Mm-hmm.
I was the only person I knew in my entire friendship group who had not been placed on an antidepressant. I mean, the numbers of us that died or were depressed or suicidal, we were a bumper crop of eternal boys of the greatest and girls of the greatest generation who could not possibly live up to the expectations our parents had for us, and were terribly depressed and had to find our way. So I hope I've given you a little sketch of centering myself with the map of Oz, defending myself with the trickster, discovering for myself what the archetype of father would be, and that my father's definition was not the only definition, that there was an archetype, and then finally to realize that I did not want to be the living embodiment of a potential that was squelched in my mother, as it was in so many women of that generation, and then finally to find the compassion to appreciate her suffering and not take it as my issue. Because my parents, and when all was said and done, wanted the best for me, and in a way got it. I mean, I did live up to their expectations in my own way. So, and they did not destroy me, and I hope I not them. So to me, those archetypes absolutely made all that I had to go through to become a doctor and to become an analyst and to become a teacher and to become a person so much easier to live, because I had some kind of overarching energy. So when I think of archetypes, that's what I think of. It's my own experience with those things that I could actually feel were superordinate to myself and absolutely formed as patterns And yet, who would know how to create a proper word and theory of this? Jung explains the term archetype is a borderline concept. It expresses something that takes place between the person and the unconscious, and also between the personal side of the unconscious and the transpersonal side of the unconscious. And while it gets lived in reality, you try to formulate it and codify it, and you lose it. It doesn't quite become a conscious concept, but as an organizing way of talking about images that make all the difference between having a life that's meaningless suffering and having a meaningfulness to it, or understanding how one's agency and identity organizes itself. It's an invaluable concept. So that's sort of who I am and where I am with relation to the archetypes.
Okay. So John, this is just incredible. Okay, because this is like this is just completely blowing my mind, because what you have demonstrated here is that you've actually experienced these things and put these ideas together through your own experience. Right? I love that in the midst of the chaos of China, both at the family level and the social level, this is something that is grounding you. This is giving you kind of the core things. This is explaining the crucial things that is happening with your parents, with your mother. So the notion of archetypes is like intensely personally real to you. So you come with, and even before you encounter Jung, you have all of this. So that's a tremendous, tremendous asset to come to Jung with. I want to ask you just one thing now. The question is, you took this kind of almost visceral understanding of archetypes and how they function, and broaden it with your 8-function model by integration with the psychological types. You kind of generalized it. You kind of said, okay, how can anybody, no matter how they are put together, use this as a tool? So would you like to talk about that, or
Yes, a little bit. And then I want to leave some time for discussions, because I
Sure.
think what I've said stirred up a lot in a lot of people. And I think we have to have that.
Okay,
but to answer you quickly, it started with my understanding from someone that the anima carries the inferior function. Jung says that somewhere. And presumably that also meant the animus carries the inferior function. And these days, I'm not as interested in hoarding the anima for men and pretending that men don't have an animus and projectively identifying that onto women, because men absolutely have an animus. So I'll leave that open. All I knew was that the part of me said, well, what carries the other functions of consciousness? That was part of it, because I was having dreams, for instance, an older man and a younger man. And I thought, well, what's older mean and younger? Well, older means more developed and younger means less developed. Well, what could those be? The auxiliary function and the tertiary function. So then I got from that, well, then it could be a father and a son. That was my first, so I was looking for which archetype. Now, having come up with this model, having answered the question from my own dreams as to which archetypes are associated with which kinds of consciousness, then I've asked myself, what does that ultimately mean? Obviously, my model is a model of a form of self-organization, that is, organization of the personal self. And I love to get archetypal models of that, and I found one. In the 19th century, the same man who was the leading expert in phrenology also was an amateur architect. Now, I'm not going to be able to say his name unless I pull his book off the shelf, and I might just be able to do that. His name was Orson Fowler, Fowler, and he invented something that became very interesting in about the 1850s called the octagon house. And it was considered a marvelous way of building a house because it would have windows on every side. There's one octagon house in San Francisco, but they were rather beautiful things. This is one in Natchez, Mississippi, if you can see it. And what I feel, there is a Beebe who invented something called the Bathysphere. That would get, William Beebe was a great naturalist. They would go down and look. And I once had a patient dream, who I was telling their dreams to me, was telling me that they'd been taken down in a bathysphere. So I'm Beebe's bathysphere for analytical psychology. And my bathysphere is a kind of octagon house because it has, my idea is that what we do is we organize a personal self. And I'm very big on the need for Jungians not to just say ego and capital S self, but to take a middle place. Edinger calls it the ego self axis. He got that idea from Neumann, who called it the self-ego axis. To me, this axis is really the little s self, and it has a much more intricate structure than just a line. It is the line between, you can say it's partly the line between the superior function and the inferior function, and what Jung calls capacity and incapacity in the Red Book, the spirit of the times and the spirit of the depths. So in that sense, the dominant function is in touch with the spirit of the times, and it can dominate and adapt. And the inferior function is not able to adapt in that way and is incapacity, but is in touch with the depths. All those ideas are nice to break down the difference between ego and capital S self. But if you take that middle piece and talk about a little s self, it really is an octagon house of the eight function model that enables us to process our self-experience. And so I'm very, very interested in that. And what I feel about the different archetypes that I chose is that by getting to think of archetypes carrying, we're back to what consciousness is associated with which archetype. It implies that archetypes are driving consciousness into the psyche, that we're not getting it from what we learn from outside as we imagine. So we're not only not born tabula rasa, that's what Jung said against John Locke. We're not born, John Locke pretty much invented the concept of consciousness for psychology and philosophy. And Jung is saying, look, consciousness is not applied to us through education, but rather already somehow present. So I don't believe that consciousness is ego consciousness, essentially. I think we're born with consciousness, and if we're lucky, we develop an ego that will hold the consciousness we have. So the consciousness we have comes from the self, and it's multifaceted, and each facet is itself driven into being by an archetype. And then if lucky, it becomes a little s self, and that little s self informs our ego far better. I mean, I had $1 million education, but it's nothing to what my archetypes gave me.
Yes, beautiful. I love the idea of the octagonal self. Okay, let's give a few questions. I have promised you that we will end at 6:30, so we'll end sharply at 6:30. So folks, please keep your questions extremely brief. It's going to be Nicholas, Andrew, Elena, and Kimberly. Nicholas, what's your question?
All right. Hi, John.
Hi.
I'm just wondering, I have a book here, which I read with some friends by
Oh, yes.
Haas and Mark.
Oh, yes.
Here.
Wonderful book, and I recommend it to all of you.
Yeah, it was very, very helpful. And some friends of mine who I believe are here recommended the book. But anywho, my question is, in the back, they give your eightfold model, and I see that each of the archetypes down the eight functions here. I'm wondering, is that in the case of dreams, where say if I dream about an old man or something, is the model designed to say that the synex in a dream would be carrying that function?
That's exactly what I have in mind. For instance, that trickster figure that I drew. Now, it's interesting that it was green, because green is often a color associated with sensation, and it might be seen as perhaps maybe even a demonic aspect of myself, perhaps my extroverted sensation. But I actually think in that one case that my real trickster, and the part of the grin that was scary, I think, or maybe me making that, was much more my introverted feeling, which was my attempt to counter my mother's my mother's extroverted feeling was commanding my puer aeternus. And so I was being the perfect child to the perfect mother, and she needed to be a good mother, and I needed to be her good child. And so my rebellion was my introverted feeling trickster. So my introverted feeling trickster was behind that picture. Now, I probably was summoning an image that for me had been demonic. The green man had terrified me as a child, and I wanted to scare my mother a little bit. But the part of me that wanted to do that was pure introverted feeling.
Thank you.
Trickster.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Andrew, Elena, Kimberly, and Jean. Andrew.
Hi, Dr. Beebe. Thank you for the wonderful talk. Quick question. Do you think that on average, thinking types have a stronger tendency to develop a negative mother complex, whereas feeling type have a stronger tendency to develop a positive mother complex? Do you associate the two at all, or is there no relation?
You know, it's very interesting what a negative mother complex is. I mean, I certainly had both a positive mother complex and a negative mother complex, and I've certainly wondered what they are. And I guess you'd have to, those are awfully large and in a certain sense, rather superficial terms. We have to kind of unpack them. What I was I had to develop my trickster side, just as Peter Pan had to have his shadow sewn on. I had to develop my introverted feeling not to be my mother's Christ, my mother's extroverted feeling, puer aeternus, because it was going to be deadly to me. And so I had to develop my introverted feeling. So that's one aspect of my negative mother complex, was my trickster. More serious was the difference between her introverted intuition. She was an introverted intuitive with extroverted feeling. So INFJ by MBTI, and I was an ENTP, extroverted intuition. I had to oppose my mother. And actually, you can read my writings and you'll find that there was a dream about Barbara Streisand. I'm taking my mother to a movie theater, and my mother's, as usual, being very difficult about finding the right seat and being seated. And on the other side, I'm holding Barbara Streisand, and I have my arm, and she's on my other side, and she's giving my mother hell. Now, Barbara Streisand was my age, and she, I think, represented an introverted, intuitive, opposing personality, willing and able to stand up to my mother. Those days, I was telling my analyst, my mother was so all over me with writing me letters 3 times a day and that kind of thing, from where she was living to where I was living, Georgia to Pennsylvania, and then Georgia to San Francisco. And I would be saying to my analyst, it takes a woman to fight a woman. And then I had this dream about Barbara Streisand, and I realized I wasn't sure whether my mother problem was my problem or my mother complex being angry at my mother was my problem. I mean, I had two problems. No wonder I was depressed. So, but the point I'm making is there's an opposing personality. There's a trickster. And if you add in the green of that grinning figure, there's even a demonic side. So, I mean, you could take a negative mother complex and find at least 3 archetypes, all negating too much mother. You know, I'll always give my mother the greatest credit, because after years of estrangement, she said to me, you know, I went through a period where I didn't see her for quite a long time. And she said, this has really been one for the record books, how long it's been since we've seen each other. She said, but it's all right, because I thought about it and I realized I didn't give you your space. I will always love her for coming to that on her own without a moment. Well, she had a little bit of psychotherapy, but not a lot. So that was a really wonderful understanding between us, that she finally understood what my opposition was about. She knew it from herself, and that enabled the very last years of her life for us to really do something very meaningful together. I will never forget it. And that there's more I can tell you, but that's enough said. So a negative mother complex is many, many things, including a bid to survive and actually a chance for the mother to redeem herself from the unthinking aspect of the positive mother complex.
Thank you. Next up is going to be Elena, Kimberly, and Jean. Elena.
First of all, it's amazing to be here. I enjoyed it pretty much. Thank you. It's amazing speech. My question is it possible to change archetypes over the course of life?
I think we must. And I think it was James Hillman who worried about the theory of a personal myth, the idea that we only have one myth to live in a life. Obviously, in a sense, when I saw the Pietà and I didn't want to live the myth. Now, my mother did have to live that myth. That was her problem. She did something in her animus gave way, and it gave way young, and it happens to some people. When they pass the 30th birthday, they sort of, it's almost as if they don't have that energy that they had when they were young, and their courage. So some people are in a myth, sadly, most of their lives, but I think some of us can see enough of a myth to give us a chance to locate perhaps another. And I think I'm one of those people who has had more than one myth in his life. Now, do we all have an ultimate myth? I can't answer that question. I think that's too limiting. And yet, you really do get the feeling sometimes that your life does have a kind of pattern or meaning. I certainly love novels where it's all finally clear. But I would like to say that I don't think I know my myth, and I'm glad I don't fully. But I've certainly enjoyed the myth pieces that I've found because they've been very helpful to me. But I don't like one myth, and therefore I don't like one archetype.
Beautiful. Next up is Kimberly, followed by Jean. Kimberly.
Yes, thank you very much. This is very illuminating. That's all I can tell you. I love Carl Jung. I'm a psychology major, and he was like one of my favorites. So my question is, can you expand more about depression and dreams? Because I dream all the time, and I remember most of my dreams, which I think is unusual for most people.
Well, you know, when I was in analysis and going through a depression can be taken to therapy can be almost something you serve. You almost serve the depression. The depression draws the libido away from the outer world and toward the inner world, so that though you don't have a lot of energy for some things, you do find there are some things you do have energy for. And I remember when I was in analysis and feeling pretty crummy at a certain level, and just always grateful for the next appointment with which would sort of last for about 3 days. And then after that, I'd be back in the blues again. But I would log in 30 dreams a week easily. And they were filled with energy. And I think that's a big discovery. And working with dreams and dream incubation, I'll never forget a particular dream of a man who was terribly depressed. It was described, I'll have trouble with senior moment, but it'll come to me naming the name of the book, but it was by a Andover theological seminary, a follower of Jung, wrote a book about a man in therapy who was a classic 55-year-old successful middle-aged man who'd fallen into a tremendous depression. And he has a dream in which he's lying by the bank of some kind of body of water. Perhaps it's not really a sea, but ocean. And he suddenly sees a trident, and he picks up the trident and is then able to spear a fish, something like that. And of course, the trident is Neptune, the god Neptune. And Neptune, I have Neptune on my ascendant in my astrological chart, is a god of intuition. And somehow, once he had the trident, he had the intuition. And so the intuitive function is really fond of looking at dreams and feeling their archetypal qualities. It's through, I believe, introverted intuition particularly, but also extroverted can pick up on archetypes as no other and get something, some meat out of them. And so I feel like that trident, that gave him what nothing else had given him to get out of his depression. That became the energy and the way to integrate the energy that his depression was aiming at. So I've always remembered that dream. Very, very important dream, I think, as an image of what can happen. And I suspect if you're dreaming, do you see the same thing, that they're giving you something that you can latch onto?
Thank you.
I'm seeing different things all the time, but they're so vivid. You would not believe how vivid they are. Oh my goodness.
Well, okay.
Thank you, folks. So we're going to take one more question, then we'll give a chance for John to make his closing statement so that he can leave by 6:30. And then we will continue to talk about our takeaways. Then we'll have a chance to talk about what each of us got from this meetup. All right. So last question is from Jean. Jean, what's your question?
John, thanks for the lecture. It's always fascinating to hear your story. It's just so personal and also relative. So I found every people seems to is damaged by their parents, especially their moms. I mean, their moms are the one who spend most time with them. So like I found it's funny. Like I have two sisters, and it seems they have very different experience with the mom. So I have a question. You don't worry. So the question is like, I personally found my sister, the reason she has conflict with the mom because they're same sensing type, and my sister's internal sensing. My mom is external sensing, and I'm external ENTP. So I'm similar as you. So I get along with my mom better. So my question is, so it seems like I found that people accomplish a lot in their life. Usually it's their mom or their dad invest a lot of their energy in their profession or their development. And so they can accomplish in the external world, but they're not internally satisfied because this may not be true to themselves. But at the same time, like if you let the people grow by themselves, they may not reach the stage of accomplishment. So that's educational conflict as a parent. What do? Do you like them naturally develop to find their way? Or do you help them to develop so they accomplish more? So it's like, which it works better? It's like, so like your mom sacrificed her, so focus on your education, you can accomplish so much. So I just wondered what do you think about that?
Well, I think lots about it. There was a very strange experience that I had when I was in college that speaks to your issue, and I'm just going to cut to the chase because of course I've told you my story, and I've told you where my mother fit in and how much she helped and how much I nevertheless had to rebel against that help. So both parts of your story are in there. And sure, the types of the parents and the types of the children make the children different. Children will have different experiences with the same parents. As being an only child, or my mother an only child, I'm talking from the standpoint as if I have no brothers and sisters, because I don't, and she didn't. But my father did have a sister and a brother, and that he had a different experience. They each had a different experience with their mother. All that's true, but to speak briefly to the question of what happens when someone makes a life possible for someone else, but doesn't make a life possible for them. I began to have a strange experience when I was about 20 years old. I found myself now separated from my mother in the sense of being an undergraduate at Harvard and she living in New Jersey, that I would look in the mirror and I would see my mother's face behind my own. And I found that very odd, and I did not understand what it meant, but that would happen. It was just an illusion or a sense or a fantasy. I'll never know what it was, but it was certainly disconcerting, you can imagine. So home in Philadelphia on a vacation, my mother would sometimes write things on pieces of paper, and sometimes things she would leave around would be a dream recount that because she always dreamed, and she would write down her dreams. She had read Freud's interpretation of dreams and she liked it, so she was interested in dreams, and so she wrote this. So she had written down a dream. She said, "I looked into a mirror and I saw no face." Well, when you take her dream and my illusion and match them together, you can see where her face had gone. That she was living through me, and I was, in a sense, living her life, but at the same time, that was not allowing her to live her life. So what does one do about that? We talk about the effect on the child, but when the parent lives for the child. But what about the effect on the parent? So that was the tragedy in this situation, that I think my separating from mother actually gave her more of her own face than she would have had otherwise. And I think what she finally ended with was amazing. And so perhaps, I think you probably heard enough to know that she was a borderline woman. I was the only one at her funeral because she had alienated everyone in her life, really. She used to say, "People make me mad." And so she was a pretty angry woman. A few weeks before she died, or a few months before she died, she had a dream which she told me. Now, my mother moved very slowly, and she maddeningly slowly. That was part of the reason Barbara Streisand was giving her hell in the movie theater, even when there was no physical reason for it. She just was deliberate. But in the dream, she was tending a tub of red snakes, and they were all in the tub, and it was her job to keep them somehow there in the tub. And one of the red snakes escaped from the tub and started going toward me. And my mother, who in real life moved very slowly, ran and leaped after that red snake to get it back in the tub. Now, I think for a borderline woman with a Jungian analyst son, that's a pretty fine resolution of a long-standing problem. that she was able to do that and have that dream, and I will always respect her for that. She had the anger of a Medusa, having really been spited by the Athena of her time. And so she really did have a problem, but that she would have the integrity and the conscience to protect her son from that makes me feel that our separation, individuation was good for both of us.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, John. John, would you like to make any closing statements for you got 2 minutes before you need to leave?
Well, the archetypes tell us where we are, who we are, and what we can be, but we have to live them. We have to think about them, and we can't know everything at first. So I haven't told you anything but what I've learned so far. I mean, I'm sure there's plenty I don't know, and let's hope so. And I hope it's worth, the game is worth the candle. People who dismiss Jung don't know what they're talking about. I mean, it doesn't stand up as an academic theory, but it sure works as a borderline concept to deal with the borderline phenomena of our lives. And my experience with a borderline mother and the part of me that had to get over participating in that is also a positive story, not a negative story. It's not a terrible story. It's a good story. And the archetypes helped enormously. And Dostoevsky gave me a choice to be the kind of father I wanted to be, and that's the part of me that teaches. And I hope if I've done a good job today, I've lived up to the archetype I discovered when I was 20. If I didn't, I'll still try it in the future.
John, thank you very much. Always a tremendous honor and just sheer delight. Thank you. Thank you.